A warm welcome to everyone all over the world. I've looked at those signed on so far, and we see a number of old friends as well as new, so thank you for spending the next hour with us, and we hope that you get a lot of value out of it. I'd like to very quickly introduce myself and my colleagues. My name is Bill Huber. I've been with ISG since most of the time since 2006, and I am our global lead for our software advisory practice. Our key presenters today are two fantastic Oracle subject matter experts, John Zenti, who is a principal consultant within our software advisory practice, and Ed Armstrong, who's a director within the software advisory practice. And you can see their bios on the screen, but both of them bring well over 20 years of cutting-edge expertise in terms of optimizing technology solutions for their various client organizations. For the agenda today, we'll give you a very quick commercial about ISG. I'll spend no more than about 30 seconds on that. And then we'll get right into an overview of the Oracle licensing models, best practices from a negotiation standpoint, both what Oracle does and what you should be doing. And then we'll go through some case studies, and we'll have time for a wrap-up and Q&A. We'll try to finish the presentation at about quarter to the hour to allow 15 minutes for questions. All right, so very quickly about ISG. The thing that you need to know about us, if you're not familiar with us, is that we are a technology research and advisory firm. So most of what we do is really targeted to help our clients to move on their digital transformation agenda with lower risk, better cost, faster time periods, and better results. The software advisory practice is one of our numerous practices that help to advise clients on acquiring technology and services. ISG has sourced nearly $500 billion in IT services and technology over our history, so there is no one in the world who has done more of this than we have. A very quick snapshot of the software advisory practice. As we'll come across very clearly in our presentation, we don't simply stop at benchmarks and terms and conditions and really great negotiation approaches. In the world of technology today, it's much deeper, and you really need to understand the details of how technology is deployed, how to optimize your bill of materials, how to understand compliance, and utilization versus entitlements, and the overall relationship strategy, and focus or factor all of those things together to get the best results. So you see across the spectrum of services that we deliver, we do support in large strategies, in compliance, in transactions, in software audit defense, and in software asset management. And then everything that we do is ultimately linked to helping you to accelerate your transformation. In other words, using the technology beneficially to help your companies perform better in the marketplace. You can see on this last slide before I turn over, this is the actual impact that we tend to have when we work with our clients in terms of when we get involved and the difference that we bring to the overall relationship cost versus before the point of our engagement. So you can see typically our average is well over 20% impact. All right, so thank you again for joining us, and let me turn over to Ed. Ed, over to you.
Thank you, Bill. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for spending time with us this morning. What I'd like to do now is to provide you with an overview of Oracle's licensing model. Now, certainly, everybody here knows or has probably had an experience with Oracle wherein you were confronted with a new licensing model, wherein you were forced to really engage and dig in to understand the cost implications to your business. And the reason being is that Oracle has a very extensive product portfolio. As you can see to the left, it's typically organized to address specific functions or areas. What this really means is that Oracle has orchestrated their solution set to really address the traditional IT resource management stack. Everything from applications, security, database, server, virtualization, storage, and whatnot is provisioned through Oracle's solution set. Now, Oracle provides many different types of licensing models to its customers. And what you really need to think about as an enterprise organization is what is the right licensing model to procure Oracle software. You've got component agreements, enterprise license agreements, unlimited license agreements, perpetual unlimited license agreements. You have prepaid, pool of funds, cloud agreements, and term license agreements. So with that, I'll walk you through the basics of how Oracle organizes licensing its products. You think about Oracle's price list, they typically reflect licensing based on two categories, technology and application licensing. Under technology, you have two primary licensing metrics, named user plus and processors. The big takeaway from this is that all use, whether it's human or non-human use of Oracle software, requires that you be licensed. Now, when you see the metric as named users, it's really a metric wherein you don't have to assign that license to a specific entity. That user who is interfacing with the Oracle application needs to be licensed. The other nuance to Oracle is that it prices its software in minimum bundles, and the bundle that you need to procure from Oracle is dependent on the product that you buy. The other element that you would procure from Oracle is a processor-based license. Now, this is different. When you think about processor-based licenses, that's really driven by the core factor table that Oracle publishes as a part of its pricing matrices. And that's driven by the OEM and the number of processors per hardware that you procure. So for example, when procuring an IBM Power 7, which has 8 cores per socket, which total about 16 cores, the licensing factor that Oracle would use to determine the licensing price is a factor of 1 multiplied by 16 cores. And again, this is very, very different based on the vendor and the number of processors that you would buy for hardware. Another example would be if you're procuring a Fujitsu Ultra T1, which has a single processor, the licensing factor that Oracle would utilize is about 0.25. The other licensing element that Oracle has is the application price book. So that's really component-based pricing, which has a mix of both user-based and usage-based metrics. You have custom applications that have different pricing metrics, and then you have enterprise pricing metrics. A common enterprise pricing metric may be total number of employees, or it could be total revenue. So let's go through each of the Oracle licensing models. The very basic model that you would procure Oracle software under is the component-based model. And this is really Oracle's default software licensing model, wherein you buy off catalog. Oracle has a published list of list prices, again, application or technology, and you would procure that off list, and it's typically offered with limited discounting based on the actual purchase that you're making. So assume for a moment that you're buying 5. Then Oracle would then apply its standard volumetric discount based on that, and really nothing above that. And with component-based pricing, this offers the least amount of flexibility with regards to your ability to negotiate the purchase price of the license and the maintenance rate if it's a perpetual on-prem license. As you move further into the Oracle licensing model, the next available construct is the enterprise license agreement. Now, This gives you as an organization more flexibility in negotiating with Oracle as it relates to both the licensing and the maintenance rate for the products that you would buy under the enterprise license agreement. The big takeaway here is that Oracle will bundle pricing for the applications that you procure under an enterprise license agreement. It's typically going to be either total revenue or total employee count. The thing to remember here is when Oracle licenses based on total revenue or total headcount, Oracle has chosen these metrics because they're easily auditable. Every agreement that you would enter into with Oracle, whether it is a click-through agreement based on you buying off price list or from the enterprise license agreement, has specific language as part of the entitlement grant that allows Oracle to audit. And so, the bundle pricing element here is specifically designed to make it easy for Oracle. The other challenge here is that once you've entered into the license agreement that you've purchased a custom bundle, it is very, very hard, if not impossible, to terminate on a line item basis. So when you get an ordering document from Oracle and it has 5 or 6 items listed on it, you won't have the capability to terminate any of those applications if your use requirements change on a line item basis because of the way that the agreement was specifically orchestrated by Oracle. So as your organization starts to reflect on what the right licensing metric is, and you assume for a moment that you need to procure many more licenses that you would get under an enterprise license agreement, and you're looking to drive deeper discounts, then the contract vehicles that Oracle would provide or offer are a unlimited license agreement or a perpetual license agreement. And as you look at the attributes of a EULA versus a PULA, they're very similar in that once you've entered into the agreement, you have the ability to use the software on an unlimited basis throughout the term of the agreement. You have to commit up front at a certain rate that covers both the software license costs and the maintenance rate. The biggest difference between the two is if you elect not to renew your EULA at the end of the term, then you have to go through a process called certification. And that process is really to determine the amount of software that you've deployed over the term of the agreement so that Oracle can establish the go-forward maintenance baseline that you would pay on a year-over-year basis. Now, the key element in a certification process as it relates to the EULA is that you don't have to pay any additional license costs. You've paid that during the term of the EULA. Now, a PULA is much different. It's much different because in a PULA, this agreement continues into perpetuity and never expires, and your license quantities are never fixed. And so organizations that are really considering a EULA or a PULA need to really reflect on what their business as usual case is versus what the advantages of a EULA or PULA are, because it does require an upfront payment. And it's generally around spend which is greater than $1 million per year. Now, organizations that are looking at some flexibility as it relates to Oracle licensing have different options that are available to it. The first option is a term license, wherein you would procure that license and use that license for a set period of time. And at the end of that period, you would lose your license entitlement to continue to use the software. The way that Oracle prices out a term license is really based on how it values the software at list price, and then it applies typical discounting factors. So for example, If you enter into a 4-year term license agreement with Oracle, then they would price that at 60% of the list license value for the perpetual asset. If you move into a 2-year agreement with Oracle, then the pricing factor is 35% of the list value of the license. And if you move into a 1-year agreement, then the discounting factor is 20% of the perpetual list license value. The thing with term licenses is you always have the option to renew that agreement either in 1, 2, or 4-year intervals. Now, in ISG's experience, our clients typically use term licenses where the organization is small or they're looking at short-term projects where they don't want to make a long-term investment in the license. It's a one-time cost, and then you pay maintenance on top of that. And at the end of the term license, you give the license back to Oracle, which gives you the freedom to move beyond that when the project ends into looking at other Oracle products or services that you'd like to onboard to support your IT roadmap. The other mechanism that Oracle offers is what's known as a pool of funds agreement, wherein you would pay Oracle a fee and you would draw down on those fees as you start to deploy licenses, and it's defined around a defined set of products. And so there is no refund in a POF arrangement with Oracle. So assume for a moment you have a IT transformation project wherein you need to procure X amount of databases, and you pay into that pool of funds about $1 million. If you don't draw down on that $1 million pool of funds during the term of the agreement, Oracle isn't going to issue you any credit, and that speaks directly to how Oracle recognizes the revenue for the funds that have been loaded in as a part of the POF. And then lastly, Oracle has been making a huge push in the marketplace to be seen as a cloud provider across all of the cloud resource stacks, from IaaS to PaaS to SaaS. In this instance, when looking at a SaaS subscription agreement, you would either pay monthly, quarterly, or annually. And again, much like the enterprise perpetual on-prem applications options that you would have, the subscription pricing is based both by number of bundles, volume, and commitment period. And one of the things that Oracle has been trying to do is to provide some recognition of the fact that a lot of its existing customer base have made a sunk investment in Oracle's on-premise estate. One of the things that Oracle does allow for is for customers to terminate the on-prem entitlement and the associated maintenance costs, and then generate a credit as it relates to the migration from, just as it relates to the maintenance component, from the on-premise estate to the cloud-based estate. And this is very different in how Oracle operates in the marketplace versus other large software publishers. So if you were to compare and contrast Oracle with SAP, SAP has a program wherein if you're migrating from the on-premise estate to the cloud estate, they will give you a conversion fund which recognizes the fact that you have made a significant investment in the on-premise licenses. Oracle does not do that. So with that said, I'd like to hand it over now to my colleague, John, who will walk you through best practices for negotiating with Oracle.
Thanks, Ed. Good morning, everyone. With respect to negotiating with Oracle, the setup is the most important aspect. What you do ahead of opening negotiations is critical to a successful outcome. That preparation necessarily includes understanding who your opponent is. Who is Oracle? one of the things you need to understand is that Oracle salespeople are exceptionally well trained, that the majority of them are not only experienced, but they're experienced with Oracle products. And those that aren't experienced with Oracle products have been in the industry of selling software products for a very long time. So you're not going to run into a salesperson that does not have a very, very strong skill set. The experience that they've built up has developed a very significant list of contacts, and that list of contacts is going to be within and without your organization. First, people who are in your organizations today and may have been recently gone from the organizations. Don't underestimate their ability to get information about your deal. It is the fundamental tool that they use to try and control the aspect of the deal in their favor. They're going to exploit those contacts as much as possible. That's going to include your executives. It's going to include engineers, architects, anyone that they believe may have visibility into what the negotiation outcome is desired. They're going to reach out and call. They're going to try to control the cadence and the timing of the negotiations. For them, that is the most important aspect of the deal. They have a forecast that they're trying to meet, and being able to control the cadence and the timing allows them to accurately forecast when the deal is going to happen. You know, your objective is to be in control of those two aspects. They're going to use quarter end and year end as weapons to dangle expiring discounts and use warnings that the negotiation process will have to start over if the timeline is missed. Those are things that are certainly something you want to consider, but again, it's your job to drive the timing and the narrative and to ensure that your execution aligns with your objectives, to hit timelines that are required for the business. Oracle's price list is something that they've put in the marketplace versus competition. And what we need to understand is that because of that, it's arbitrary. And being arbitrary brings flexibility to the table. What one customer pays and another customer pays are entirely dependent on the negotiation ability of each organization. And a well-planned, well-thought-out, properly executed negotiation is going to be far more successful than one that's not. One of the things that Oracle will attempt to do is to suggest products and volumes that were not in your original scope, but because of the people that they've spoke to, may indicate volumes that you need in the near future. Something else they may do is to offer you free products. They won't tell you that that free product will have a maintenance cost that isn't free, however. And they might hint that they're aware of compliance issues. And whenever that occurs, it's critical that you understand whether or not that's just a red herring or if they might have insights into a reality. When they execute negotiations, they try to keep a myopic focus on each deal as transactional. And they're going to ignore your history. They're going to ignore the relationship. They're going to ignore if they even have another deal in process for a different tower, right? You may be negotiating this deal for technology products and one of your peers is negotiating for applications. They will do their best to keep those transactions separate. And it's your job to bring them together to value the deal as one entire deal to drive leverage across both deals. There are 5 tactics that you really want to pay particular attention to. Number 1, they want to find out what your budget is for the deal. This is your number 1 crown jewel that you need to keep secret. You need to make sure that the team that has access to that information is not going to share it under any circumstance. If they find out what the budget of the deal is, they're going to make sure that the deal comes in under budget, but you're not going to be able to drive any enhanced value beyond that. The second crown jewel is your buying timeline. When does your IT organization need to deploy the product? Once they have that data point, again, they get to control the timeline. You have to be able to bring flexibility to the timeline that causes them pressure to hit your objectives. They're going to try to push product that is in their marketing plan for the quarter, and usually these days that's cloud product. We've seen a lot of deals where Oracle has tried to wrap in cloud product as a sweetener, if you will. If you give me an example, if you spend $100,000 on these cloud licenses, we'll give you an extra percentage off of the on-premise licenses that you need, so that they're allowed to reflect to the marketplace cloud penetration. The keys there are to determine whether or not that cloud offering is in something you're going to use. If it is, it's a huge lever. It's a significant opportunity to drive value out of the deal. If it isn't, it's just purely a math exercise. Does the spend warrant additional discounts to bring you closer to your objective of your price targets and feature sets? On the audit side of the house, they are going to threaten to audit even if they don't have any evidence that you're out of compliance. We've seen it as a tactic many times where they just bring it to the table and see if it gets a reaction out of the negotiations. As long as you're prepared and you know that that's either real or not real, it puts the power back in your hands and it takes it out as a weapon from Oracle's side of the equation. Contract T's and C's are something that has to be defined at the very beginning of the negotiations. If you don't bring it to the table early, they'll use it as a weapon against you to try and prevent those contract terms from being considered. They will threaten to reset the discounts, indicate that the deal has to be reset from a negotiation standpoint. If you bring it up at the beginning, it takes the weapon right out of their hands. Best practices is at the top of the list, preparation. You want to make sure, number one, that you understand exactly what you have deployed and how does that contrast against what you're entitled. We call this an effective license position. This identifies where you have software that you've paid for that you're not using, and also identifies where you've deployed software that you don't own. Both of those are critical to understand before entering into any negotiation with Oracle to ensure you can control the narrative around compliance, because nothing will derail your negotiations faster than the uncovering of a compliance problem during negotiations. It will literally cause Oracle to completely reset the baseline, and your ability to drive a successful outcome is going to be significantly impaired. Knowing your inventory is something that most organizations don't have the competency for. Software asset management is something that everyone strives for, but very few people excel in. If you don't have the in-house competency to be able to develop an effective license position, then we highly recommend you reach out to someone like ISG to hire as a trusted advisor to help you assemble that prior to negotiations. Because once you've got that, it helps you leverage the deal. If you've got software that is shelfware, then you can use that as a loss of value argument with Oracle to help drive an improvement in the deal for what software you do need. And as a side note, if you identify shelfware, one of the first things you want to consider is whether or not you can cleanly terminate the maintenance on that shelfware so that you're not paying for it. Many times that's difficult to do, depending on how you've orchestrated the deal, as Ed pointed out earlier. But it is something that we recommend an analysis be done, and we can certainly help you do that. Once you've put together what you need based on your effective license position, that allows you to have the foundation to create the models that show the financial and practical impact of the different remediation strategies to any compliance you've got. And it's going to help you ultimately select the optimal strategy and align your IT stakeholders to ensure that everyone's marching to the same objective. Sorry, I went one too far. The first thing you need to do when you are establishing your effective license position is to crack open your agreements and make sure exactly how they were orchestrated. Were they part of a ULA, an unlimited license agreement, right? What were the legal entities for each of the ordering documents? Did you have worldwide use rights, or were you limited to geography, right? What are your cloud rights? Once you effectively identified that, that allows you to go into a tactical purchase and ensuring that you only outline the products that you absolutely need, that there's nothing that is being brought to the table that is something that's not necessarily needed. Sometimes your business owners will come to the table and say, I need 100 licenses as a database. If you don't have an effective license position, you're going to have to take their word for that. But if you have an effective license position, you can push back. Well, hey, wait a minute, guys. I'm seeing here that you've got 20 licenses that you haven't deployed. Did you consider that as part of your math? And it becomes an opportunity for you to show some significant value back to the technology team. On the ULA side of the fence, if you're looking at entering into a ULA with Oracle, it allows you to really focus in on the critical aspects of a EULA. It allows you to have a high degree of certainty into what it is that you're buying and focus in on the projected consumption as your value lever. Part of your preparation necessarily includes treating your negotiation as a project and ensuring that the right personnel are tied to the project, right? You want someone from finance, you want someone in the business who owns it, you want someone from legal, you want sourcing, VMO, and leadership. It's important that each of those people that is likely to get a flyer from Oracle have some involvement in the project, or be over personnel that are likely to get pinged by Oracle seeking information. The lack of doing this can often be catastrophic. Again, Oracle is going to try and go over you, around you, and under you to get the information they need to drive the narrative. Keeping the team in the loop is absolutely critical. They need to know where you are in the process, what objectives have been met, what objectives are still outstanding. You're going to want to provide them talking points and a narrative to ensure that any attempts by Oracle are met with one unified message. Once you've aligned the project team, you've got a definition of what the scope is. That's where you define your strategy and begin to formulate the execution of that, right? You want to define your objectives. You want to research Oracle and understand their key business objectives and their key competitors. If they've indicated something in their last quarterly report around objectives for cloud products in the coming quarter or year, and you need cloud products along with perpetual, you've got a significant lever that you can tug on to improve the value proposition of the deal. Make sure you've got alignment with your stakeholders, AKA the project team, objectives, the narrative, roles and responsibilities. Set your strategy with Oracle. Define the value to Oracle. Define the rules of engagement with Oracle. Again, that's critical. You need to tell them up front, there is one voice managing this negotiation, and it is you. They're not to communicate outside of the negotiation team, and everything remains singularly focused on those key members of the organization. You're going to want to manage the deal after you kick off negotiations. Again, communication is at the top of the list. Make sure that the harmonized message is clear and distinct across the organization and the team. Make sure your talking points are in place, and that whenever Oracle does try to go around you, that the messages are reverberated back to them. Keep your team informed. That makes sure there are no slip-ups with regard to where you are in the process. Again, nothing would derail something but worse than obtaining an objective and have somebody not aware of that and then request less than your objective. Keep Oracle in the box that you define, and the timeline is a critical component of that box. Once things are progressing, I'm going to reiterate again, communication with the team members is very important. You want to make sure you touch base with each one of them. You want to know if Oracle has reached out to them. You want to know if they might be a little anxious around the timing of the deal. You want to be able to alleviate that ahead of it actually materializing within negotiation. When ISG is asked to engage on behalf of the clients, we will follow a very tightly orchestrated process to ensure the maximum outcomes for our clients. And we do have a great deal of success of being able to identify information as part of that process that the client was not aware of. Some of the examples I gave earlier where, they come to us saying we need to buy 100 processors of database. We go through the process and determine, hey, did you realize you had 20 processors that you had not used? And that brings some significant value to the table. We see it orchestrated across all product lines, as well as being able to help orchestrate a process plan that allows for timing and messaging and developing negotiation strategy with some value levers that help ensure an optimal deal. I'd like to transition this over to Mr. Huber so that he can walk through some case studies.
All right. Thank you so much, John and Ed. So I think, or I hope that based on the presentation so far, all of you have come away really with a feeling that a lot of this is almost a little bit of inside baseball, right? There are a lot of arcane approaches and rules. And when you're dealing with one of the tier one software publishers, the Oracles, the Microsofts, the SAPs, the Salesforces, the ServiceNows, the AWSs, it's a very different situation than with a smaller supplier who really doesn't control such a large segment of the market. Most likely, when you've negotiated any of your prior agreements with them, you've largely done them on the supplier paper. And what that means is that the supplier, the Oracles of the world, they define how entitlements are structured or how they're defined. They define the licensing metrics. They define most of the rules for compliance. And they have the ability to have a very specialized staff in place that very aggressively asserts those entitlements and those rights from their perspective, and they have a very deep knowledge of a lot of arcane rules and that define the commercials behind that. So it's very difficult, even for the best strategic sourcing expert or the best inside or outside counsel or the best IT manager, really to understand all of the potential levers and gotchas. So, going back to the slide John presented 2 slides ago, you really need to bring together the right team if you're really going to maximize your position in this type of negotiation. So if there's one takeaway that I would just want you to leave with, it is just that. You really do need very specialized expertise to maximize the value of your transaction and your relationship with a supplier like Oracle, and to protect yourself. All right, so let me get into 3 case studies very quickly. The first was first of all done with one of the most pleasant Oracle negotiation teams that we worked with. They made a business case for the client to make a significant migration of their traditional on-premise estate moving into the cloud. And their estate included Primavera, it included a lot of the e-business suite, and especially on the financial side, as well as a lot of their traditional databases, Exadata, things like that. They put forward a business case for the client to move to the cloud. And in this case, not only did we review the entitlements, but we also looked very carefully at the business case, because the client didn't have to move to the cloud at that point in time, but Oracle was very motivated in getting the move to the cloud. So once we actually dissected the business case, factored in a bunch of things that Oracle missed from the business case, in addition to some of the points that John and Ed brought up earlier in today's discussion, we were able to get to a very positive, amicable outcome. But that outcome drove about a 25% savings to the client, and to the tune of a few $1 million. So it was a really nice win-win story. Oracle came away with a happy client in this case, and but at the same time, it was a question of bringing transparency to a transaction between 2 very positive teams on both sides of the table. Case study 2, this is one of those situations where stuff happens that you don't expect. So the client had a strategy. They were migrating a lot of their ERP away from Oracle, but they did plan on continuing support utilizing IBM when IBM announced that they were going to and a certain product offering or service offering around supporting the Oracle environment. So the client was in a situation where they had to scramble to get back on support directly from Oracle in order to support their business operations. And in this case, again, we were able to look at the new cloud component of what they needed to purchase, as well as their ongoing support, and we're able to bring them a very, very significant reduction in both levels, to the tune of 20% better than what they were doing on the cloud component, and an overall cost avoidance of over $7 million in addition. The last case study is for a client that was being audited by Oracle, and the Oracle audits can be very challenging, and in this case, we were able to look at their actual utilization, look at what specific licenses and modules had been activated, were being used. We were able to show where there were a few cases where certain actions were taken in a test environment at Oracle's instruction. But bottom line, we were able to make almost the entire liability go away to the tune of about $4.5 million, because we were able to forensically resolve all of the matters of fact between the client and Oracle, and resolve those matters of fact substantially in the client's favor. So 3 very quick case studies, and kind of give you an example of the breadth of approaches that we've had working with our clients. A lot of our client engagements have been much more straightforward than some of these, but these were a few examples of the more interesting ones. So first of all, thank you all for listening so long, and I'm sure there are lots of questions. So I'm going to turn back to Jill in just a moment to open up the questions. But if you haven't already, please look at the bottom of your screen. You can type in your questions there, and we will get through as many of them as we can in the next 15 or so minutes. Jillian?
Thanks, Bill. Let's go ahead and dive into the questions we've received so far. First one, does Oracle usually provide a credit to support a migration to its cloud products in recognition of a customer's investment in its on-prem licenses? John, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Ed alluded to it during the presentation, but it is something that has been a change for Oracle. When cloud first came to the marketplace, Oracle was offering a credit for the on-premise investment that you had made. And I want to say within the last 3 years, Oracle made a very strong about face on that and stopped providing any sort of a credit for your on-premise investment. Initially, this was met with very strong customer resistance, but ultimately Oracle held to their guns and they have eliminated the process at this point. The only thing that they're willing to do is to allow you to terminate the maintenance on those licenses, regardless of any ordering document constraints that may be present. So you'll be able to terminate the maintenance on those, and if you've got any outstanding prepaid maintenance from a time period, they will fully credit you 100% on those prepaid licenses.
Thank you, John. And our next question, are there any downsides to entering a EULA? Ed, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Yes, thank you, Jillian. So there are many downsides to entering into a EULA. So for example, in the example that I had cited previously, if you have a short-term need to procure Oracle licenses to facilitate some project, the EULA is not the right contract vehicle. If you've not appropriately laid out your business as usual case versus the EULA, then EULA is not the right contract vehicle for you. If you have a sense that you're going to want to manage the estate over the term of the EULA based on your actual use of licenses, the EULA is not the right contract vehicle for you. Again, remember, the biggest element around a EULA is that you have to agree up front with Oracle around the capital investment that you're going to be making for the licensing assets based on the discrete product list, as well as the ongoing OpEx as it relates to those assets. And that's boiled in as part of the payment that you have to make. And then certainly when you're coming out of the EULA, there's a certification process that you have to look at. But in as much as there are many downsides to entering a EULA, there are many upsides to entering a EULA. And that's really predicated on the business case that you have, which is driven by the Oracle roadmap that you and the organization have created.
And I'm going to add a little bit to that. One of the areas that is absolutely critical in understanding whether or not a EULA is a successful mechanism for you is if your organization has a stable, forward-looking roadmap. If you're an organization that regularly divests entities or is in a strong M&A activity, your EULA is going to have extreme restrictions on being able to divest aspects from it. You won't be able to terminate. If you have to send licenses to the divesting entity, that's going to require what we call a ransom from Oracle to be able to do that. It will basically be rebuying licenses at somewhere between 85 and 90% of a discount, but that can be significant. A EULA bundles all of the products into one ordering document. So you have no mechanism of being able to strip out terminations for any quantities or products that you might no longer need.
All right, thanks guys. Next question. We are facing challenges with our SAP contract, including some noise around compliance issues, and we're planning to issue an RFP to leverage Oracle against SAP in an RFP process. What are some of the elements we should include in the RFP? Who wants to take that one?
Well, let me weigh in and then John can follow. But if you've made a significant investment with SAP and you're using Oracle to try to create some leverage, some of the questions that you have to fundamentally answer is, what is my sunk investment in the licensing estate? How much of that licensing estate has been depreciated? Because let's say for a moment that you've invested $30 million and you've only depreciated a quarter of the estate. Chances are that Oracle is going to know that there is really no earnestness around migrating from SAP to Oracle. The composition of the RFP is really going to be driven by the target outcomes that the customer is looking to achieve as a part of any sort of RFP package with Oracle and with SAP. The biggest issue is, what are the business processes that you're looking to enable? How do those business processes map from SAP to Oracle? What are my budget considerations? What are my ongoing termination rights with SAP? Because with SAP, the same sort of situation you'd find with Oracle. Their agreements are designed to keep you in, and your ability to terminate at the line item level or at the ordering document level is going to be based on how you architected and negotiated your entitlements and cost obligations.
Thanks, Ed. John, anything to add to that?
Yeah. I think it's important to understand that both SAP and Oracle have some really experienced sales teams. They're going to know if you're throwing up a false argument. You know, if to Ed's point, if you've got a $30 million investment in your existing ERP, and let's say you acquired a couple of entities that are using the opposite. So let's say you have SAP and the entities you bought have Oracle. So you want to drive some sort of competitive tension. Well, if you're at 30 million and the two acquired entities are only at 5, it's not really a valid argument, because you're not going to relinquish your $30 million investment in SAP and rebuy Oracle at that value. So any competitive arguments that you make have to be legitimate. Otherwise, it just won't hold any water as part of the strategy.
All right, thank you both. Next question is, what are some of the main elements that we should look at when determining if there's a business case to move from on-prem to SaaS offerings from Oracle?
So I think that the key there is, are there some operational advantages to moving to the cloud that are going to drive cost efficiencies beyond just the product transition? Because there really is no savings from a software value chain perspective for moving from on-premise to the cloud. The costs are going to be comparable. The advantage is being able to take Oracle and help them from a marketing perspective from transitioning to off-premise to cloud and deliver some additional discounts. But the ultimate aspect is, what's your benefit? Am I going to be able to deliver a platform that's more stable, has quicker response times? Am I going to be able to reduce my own data center footprint to eliminate those costs? Is there an operational efficiency that I can gain from that?
Okay, next question. Can you offer any insights on Oracle's willingness to reduce subscription costs for a long-term cloud ERP deal in a new sector for them?
So that's an absolute certainty, yes. If this is a sector that has been unwilling to transition to Oracle's cloud product, then they're going to be incented to be able to add that label as part of their package. And now that means that the client would have to be willing to be used from a marketing standpoint. If the answer is no, then they have no marketing leverage that they can use to help penetrate the rest of the industry that they're trying to get in. And but I will say, how much of a financial benefit is entirely dependent upon the scope of the deal and the value of having the logo in their catalog.
All right, and it looks like we have time for one more question, and that is, should maintenance be negotiated at the time of licensing cost?
Let me take this one. Yes, you should be negotiating each of the cost elements at the same time with Oracle. Now, In the recent past, Oracle is aligned to a 22% maintenance rate. Your ability to drive 1 to 3 points off of that is really going to be determined by some of the factors that we talked about. In the example that John cited, assume that it's an on-prem environment that you're looking to license in a sector like banking or utilities, where Oracle really hasn't made any traction vis-a-vis its nearest competitors in that space. You have now the opportunity to try to drive a reduction in the maintenance space. And remember, maintenance is calculated as a function of the net license fee paid by Oracle.
Something else to consider there is that once you've orchestrated the deal, the maintenance is locked. You won't be able to renegotiate the maintenance rate going forward. The best you'll be able to do is to negotiate out any uplifts that Oracle brings to the table as part of the renewal. And if you're doing annual renewals, you will have very little success in being able to eliminate that annual uplift.
All right, very insightful discussion. Thank you all. This does conclude our time today. We appreciate you joining this ISG Smart Talk. As mentioned, the recording of this webinar will be available at the same link you used to register. But if you have any questions or would just like to get in touch, you can find us at www.isg-one.com. Thanks for listening.